Welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories, the podcast where we pair captivating tales of the past with the warmth of a cozy night in. I am so happy you've decided to join me tonight. So go ahead, settle in, get comfy, maybe pour yourself a soothing cup of tea or grab your favorite blanket. Tonight, we're going to take a wild ride back in history with the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. It's a story of love, danger, and life on the run. But before we jump into the chaos and romance of these infamous outlaws, I've got something special to share with you. I will be at CrimeCon 2025 coming up September 5th through the 7th in Denver, Colorado, and I would absolutely love to meet you there. Even better, when you use my discount code, which is BRINK, B-R-I-N-K, at checkout when you buy your tickets, you'll not only save on your ticket, but you can contact me to receive a free signed copy of one of my True Crime Sleep Stories books. So that's right, I'll give you a little keepsake just for helping me out by using my discount code for CrimeCon 2025. So mark your calendars and grab that discount while you can. And now, get cozy, let's slip into the thrilling world of Bonnie and Clyde. On a lonely, sun-drenched stretch of road just outside Gibbsland, Louisiana, the silence was shattered by the thunderous roar of gunfire. Bullets tore through the dusty air, splintering the windshield of their stolen Ford V8 as Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow went limp under the ceaseless barrage. Within seconds, it was over. The young lovers who had captured the attention and terror of an entire nation lay lifeless, their bodies riddled with bullet holes, their tale written in blood. This is where their story ended, but it's far from where it began. Bonnie and Clyde were more than criminals on the run. They were icons of rebellion, lovers defying the odds in a time of despair. To some, they were heartless killers. To others, they were tragic figures trapped by circumstance and driven by a dream of freedom in the unforgiving grip of the Great Depression. Together, they carved their names into the annals of American history, leaving behind a legacy that has outlived the sound of that final gunfire. Their story has become legend, adapted for film, glorified in ballads, and dissected by historians. But the truth? It's far grittier, much bloodier, and infinitely more human than the myths allow. Bonnie and Clyde were living proof of the chaotic collision between love and desperation, the delicate balance between devotion and destruction. They burned brightly and chaotically, leaving behind a trail of broken glass, empty shells, and stolen dreams. This episode doesn't just recount their rise and fall, it takes you into the heart of their tumultuous world. It explores the magnetic pull between them, forged in hardship and fueled by defiance. It examines the choices they made and the devastating consequences that followed. Above all, it seeks to answer the question that lingers even today: why do we remain so captivated by Bonnie and Clyde? Their story isn't just history, it's love and rebellion, sacrifice and consequence, all tangled in a narrative that refuses to die. And it begins here on a dusty road in Louisiana, where the air still echoes with the thunder of that final act. If the final chapter of Bonnie and Clyde's story unfolded in a violent storm of bullets, their beginnings were shaped by the quiet erosion of hope. To truly understand the choices they made and the paths they followed, you have to go back to the dusty plains of rural Texas, where hardship and dreams collided to mold two very different lives that would ultimately intertwine with devastating consequences. Bonnie Parker was born October 1st, 1910, in the town of Rowena, Texas. Her early years started with promise, but tragedy soon marked her life. When she was just 4 years old, her father passed away, leaving her mother to shoulder the burden of raising Bonnie and her siblings alone. The family eventually moved to the bustling slums of West Dallas, a stark contrast to the quieter life they had once known. Despite the struggles around her, Bonnie stood out. She was bright, imaginative, and fiercely ambitious. She adored writing poetry, dreaming of a life that extended far beyond the confines of her modest home. Fame, whether it was on the stage or in Hollywood, seemed to shimmer on the edge of her horizon. But life had other plans. At just 15 years old, 6 days before her 16th birthday, Bonnie married Roy Thornton, a reckless young man who promised adventure but brought heartbreak instead. The marriage quickly grew stale, and Roy's brushes with the law only added to Bonnie's sense of feeling trapped and disconnected. Although they never formally divorced, Bonnie drifted away from him, holding tightly to her dreams while the weight of her reality bore down harder each day. Clyde Barrow, on the other hand, was born into hardship from the very start. He arrived on March 24, 1909, in Ellis County, Texas, the fifth of 7 children in a family struggling to make ends meet as tenant farmers. By the time Clyde was a child, his family had abandoned the land, moving to the harsh, poverty-stricken neighborhoods of West Dallas in search of better prospects. Life there was hard. Cramped homes, empty tables, and constant reminders of what they didn't have. But Clyde was more than just a product of his environment. He was sharp and quick-witted, with a charm that often masked his growing frustration towards the world. Poverty may have been the catalyst, but it was Clyde's mounting resentment towards authority that pushed him to act. He turned to petty thefts, stealing whatever he could to ease the struggles his family faced, or perhaps to rebel against them altogether. He was clever enough to get away with it too, at least for a while. 2 young lives shaped by struggles they never asked for were unknowingly edging towards one another. Bonnie, restless and longing for grandeur, Clyde, hardened by deprivation, but charismatic enough to dream of something better. Neither had yet crossed the line that would make them the infamous figures they would become. But their origins, steeped in poverty, shaped by loss, and defined by defiance, set the stage for everything that came next. Their love and their crimes were born from these roots, tangled in a history that left little room for escape. Their partnership was still just a future waiting to happen, but the seeds of rebellion and ambition were there, growing quietly in the shadows of West Dallas. All it would take was a spark to ignite them. In January of 1930, West Dallas was a patchwork of battered homes and unpaved roads, a rough backdrop for lives scraping by. Among this grit, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow met for the first time at a mutual friend's house. The air that day buzzed with the electricity of chance. Though neither of them could know it in that moment, this meeting would change everything. Bonnie, 19 years old and trapped in a loveless marriage to a man serving time for robbery, was already bruised by life, but far from defeated. She clung to her romantic ideals, still envisioning herself as a star of some grand adventure. Her charm was undeniable, and for someone like Clyde, it was magnetic. Clyde, at 21, was charming in his own right. A smooth talker and a casual confidence that masked the sharp edges of his poverty-hardened past. He was ambitious, clever, and he had a knack for making an impression. When he walked into that room, it wasn't long before Bonnie noticed him, and when their eyes met, something clicked. The connection was instant and undeniable. They talked, laughed, and shared glimpses of their inner worlds. Bonnie's poetry and yearning for more, and Clyde's dreams of escaping the grind and grabbing life by the horns. For Bonnie, Clyde represented excitement, a break from the monotony and restlessness she had been drowning in. For Clyde, Bonnie's fierce intelligence and loyalty promised a partner like no other. It wasn't just attraction. There was an understanding between them, a shared hunger for something more. Their bond may have continued to blossom uninterrupted had fate not stepped in. A few weeks after their meeting, Clyde was arrested for a series of petty crimes. For many, this might have been the end of their story, a fleeting romance extinguished, but not for Bonnie. Her devotion was fierce from the start. She visited Clyde in jail, proving her steadfast loyalty not just with words, but with action. It was Bonnie who smuggled a small handgun into Clyde during one of her visits, a bold act that signaled just how deeply she was already committed. The gun helped Clyde escape in March 1930, leading to a brief, wild taste of freedom. But freedom, as it would turn out, was fleeting. Clyde was recaptured just weeks later and sentenced to hard labor at the brutal Eastham Prison Farm in Texas. While Clyde languished behind bars, enduring the abuses and indignities of a broken prison system, Bonnie waited. 2 years passed, but her loyalty to him never wavered. For Clyde, the time in prison only hardened him further, shaping the man he would become. His bitterness toward authority deepened, and his desire to break free, permanently this time, grew more urgent. Everything changed in early 1932 when Clyde was finally paroled. His release wasn't just freedom from those chains, it was the beginning of something much bigger. Reunited with Bonnie, he wasn't the same man who had walked into that West Dallas house 2 years before. The charm and wit were still there, but now there was a simmering anger just beneath the surface, a determination to never be caged again. Together, Bonnie and Clyde were ready to take on the world, or at least carve out their own corner of it. Clyde Barrow walked out of prison in 1932, but he wasn't the same man who had gone in. The Eastham Prison Farm was more than cages and hard labor. It was a crucible of violence and cruelty that shaped him into someone colder, angrier, and infinitely more dangerous. He had entered as a petty thief, but the abuse he endured behind bars hollowed out whatever hope for reform might have existed. Clyde's bitter hatred for the legal system now consumed him, fueling a growing resolve to retaliate against the forces he believed had wronged him. For him, the law was no longer a simple authority to fear. It was an enemy to fight. Bonnie, too, had changed in those 2 long years. She had waited for Clyde, clinging to her romantic ideals like a lifeline in a sea of loneliness. When the prison gates finally opened and Clyde walked free, Bonnie didn't hesitate. She was at his side, as devoted as ever, ready to build the life they dreamed of, no matter how dangerous it might be. The reality they faced, however, was bleak. Jobs were scarce, and their names carried little more than stigma. What began as a desperate struggle to survive soon spiraled into small-time crime, robbing gas stations, grocery stores, and hardware shops. Their first few robberies were clumsy affairs lacking the finesse that would later define their reputation. But through every dashed escape or hasty plan, Bonnie was there. She wasn't just Clyde's partner in crime, she was his anchor. A defining moment in their early days came late one evening after a particularly harrowing escape. Exhausted, Bonnie nursed a minor gunshot wound Clyde had suffered in their sprint from the law. She pressed her hand to his face, looking into his tired eyes, and whispered, "We'll make it through this." It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about her loyalty and their unshakable bond. Whatever life threw at them, they were determined to face it together. Despite their modest beginnings, bigger ambitions were soon on the horizon. By late 1932, their growing recklessness and notoriety caught the attention of Clyde's older brother, Buck Barrow. Recently released from his own stint in prison, Buck had tried to go straight, but Clyde's charisma was irresistible, and Buck soon joined his younger brother's exploits. With Buck came Blanche, his wife, who was dragged reluctantly into their world of danger and chaos. Together they formed the core of what would become the Barrow Gang. This newly expanded crew brought more audacity to their escapades, but also more risks. They pulled off a string of robberies that included banks, a step up from the gas stations and corner stores of Clyde's early days. These weren't smooth heists out of Hollywood films. They often ended in wild car chases, shootouts, and narrowly avoided traps. Clyde was obsessed with fast cars, and his skill behind the wheel became one of their greatest assets. When a robbery went south, he relied on speed and daring maneuvers to outrun law enforcement, often kicking up clouds of dust on rural roads and cutting through towns like a phantom under the cover of night. But the Barrow gang's criminal trajectory was littered with mistakes. Early on, their lack of careful planning led to sloppy escapes, injuries, and strained relationships within the group. Blanche, in particular, struggled with the violence that seemed to follow them everywhere they went, a stark contrast to the man she had married in Buck. Clyde's temper, hardened by prison and frustration, sometimes boiled over, pushing his crew to the brink of collapse. Yet for all their errors, the Barrow gang was evolving, learning from each disaster how to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless. By the end of 1933, Bonnie and Clyde were no longer small-time criminals. They were becoming infamous. Their lives were marked by adrenaline-fueled robberies, narrow escapes, and the steely resolve of a couple who had embraced their roles as outlaws. But the path they'd chosen was a dangerous one, and the mistakes they made in these early days would eventually catch up to them. For now, though, the road stretched endlessly before them, and they drove with fury like they could outrun the rest of the world. By 1933, Bonnie and Clyde's story was leaving behind the shadows of small-time crime and blazing into a new and dangerous frontier. Their robberies had grown bolder, targeting larger establishments like banks, and their methods had turned darker, laced with increasing violence. Each heist seemed to up the stakes, with shootouts becoming a near-inevitable climax. The Barrow gang's audacity knew no bounds, and their penchant for chaos soon gripped the nation in both fear and morbid fascination. Their frequent clashes with law enforcement only added fuel to the fire. The gang's trademark Ford V8 roared down highways and back roads, the powerful engine almost as famous as the fugitives it carried. Clyde, with his uncanny skill behind the wheel, could thread them through near-impossible escape routes, weaving through gunfire and slipping away from police traps. These harrowing getaways were almost operatic in their intensity, a storm of screeching tires, deafening gunshots, and desperate, dust-filled chases. But the risks of such an unforgiving life couldn't be outrun forever. A harsh reminder came one sweltering summer evening in 1933. After a robbery gone wrong, Clyde pushed his getaway car too hard, and the overworked engine failed him. The car swerved violently off the road and crashed down a small ravine. The heat from the radiator and a spilled chemical battery erupted, and Bonnie was trapped inside, flames crackling at her legs before Clyde could pull her free. The burns Bonnie suffered were excruciating, searing her skin and leaving her barely able to walk. For weeks, Clyde cared for her with a tenderness few would have believed him capable of. He gently washed her wounds, ripped his own shirts into makeshift bandages, and carried her when she couldn't walk. Whatever doubts might have existed about their bond were silenced in those months. The legendary outlaw was, at his core, a man utterly devoted to his partner. Bonnie, fragile yet undaunted, remained resolute. She hadn't chosen this life only to turn back when it got hard, burns or no burns. Meanwhile, their trail of daring crimes and run-ins with the law only served to intensify the public's captivation with the duo. Newspapers splashed their names and faces across headlines in bold type. Photographs, often recovered from abandoned hideouts, showed them posing with defiant smirks, pistols in hand, young, armed, and dangerous. These images electrified readers, feeding the curious and thrilling those enamored with the idea of two lovers standing defiantly against the system. The press, intentionally or not, crafted mystery around Bonnie and Clyde. They became symbols of rebellion in a country still staggering under the Great Depression. While the law saw them as ruthless killers and thieves, many working-class Americans saw something else: young outlaws thumbing their noses at authority and carving their own paths in a world that seemed stacked against them. Bonnie, with her sharp features and sophisticated poses, gained a certain tragic allure. Clyde, with his sly grin, was the charming bandit, a modern-day Robin Hood with no qualms about taking what he wanted. Yet the reality was far from romantic. For all the headlines and photographs, life on the run was grueling. Each robbery, no matter how carefully planned, ended in chaos. Bullets flying, bodies dropping, and the gang fleeing the scene in their battered Ford. They rarely stayed in one place for long, always conscious of the bounty on their heads, growing higher with each passing day. Nights were spent in abandoned farmhouses or under open skies, eating canned food and nursing wounds. Even so, the legend of Bonnie and Clyde grew irresistible, fed by a press eager for larger-than-life stories and a public all too eager to believe in the fantasy. They were no longer just criminals, they were icons, and as their notoriety swelled, so too did the stakes. Each heist, every shootout, they all led to an inevitable question hovering just over the horizon. How long could the fire burn before it consumed them completely? For now, though, Bonnie and Clyde pressed on, their passion for one another blazing like a torch lighting their path. They remained inseparable, bound by a love as fervent as the chaos that surrounded them, and against the backdrop of a country on edge, they clung to that love as they sped forward into even greater peril. By 1934, the relentless march of time and the burden of their notoriety were beginning to tighten the noose around Bonnie and Clyde. Their once daring escapades and narrow escapes had given way to a new, suffocating reality. A life spent dodging shadows, peering over shoulders, and wondering who might betray them next. The Barrow Gang, once a small-knit crew bound by loyalty, had fragmented. Members were dead, jailed, or had simply vanished, leaving Bonnie and Clyde increasingly isolated as they roamed the back roads of the American South. Pressure from law enforcement had been mounting for months. Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, a stoic and methodical lawman with a reputation for success, was brought out of retirement specifically to hunt them down. Hamer was relentless in his pursuit, combing through leads, piercing together their movements, and building a network of informants. Meanwhile, Clyde's growing recklessness only exacerbated their peril. Their movements were less calculated, their allies fewer, and the net around them drew tighter with each passing day. The inevitable betrayal came quietly as it often does. A former accomplice, worn down by law enforcement threats and promises of leniency, divulged enough details about Bonnie and Clyde's habits and routes to give Hamer and his posse the edge they needed. It was in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, near a quiet, dusty road flanked by trees and scrub, that their long run came to a violent and abrupt end. The ambush was set with precision. Hamer and his hand-picked posse, hardened men, experienced in violence, waited in silence as dawn broke over the humid Louisiana landscape. The air was thick with tension, the sounds of nature drowned out by hearts pounding in anticipation. Clyde's Ford V8 approached slowly, its once pristine exterior now battered from endless chases, its cabin carrying the weight of their frenetic years on the run. Inside, Bonnie and Clyde were likely unaware that every mile of that road was drawing them closer to their final moments together. The attack was swift and merciless. The posse opened fire before the car even had a chance to come to a full stop. Bullets rained down in a deafening fury, splintering glass, ripping through metal, and riddling the occupants inside. Clyde, behind the wheel, had no time to react. Bonnie, seated beside him, barely had a chance to scream. The shooting, ceaseless and unyielding, went on until the car was a skeletal frame of smoldering metal, its tires blown, its windows shattered. When the dust settled and the smoke cleared, silence returned to the remote road. The bodies of Bonnie and Clyde slumped together in the front seat, riddled with dozens of bullet holes. Blood pooled beneath them, soaking the tattered floorboards of the car. Their personal belongings, haunting relics of lives lived on the edge, remained untouched amidst the carnage. Bonnie's poetry notebook, filled with melancholic verses that hinted at a longing for something more, lay beside her. A half-eaten sandwich, mundane but poignant in its humanity, sat on the dashboard. Frank Hamer and his men stood solemnly as they surveyed the bloody scene. Each of them knew they had brought down two of the most infamous criminals in American history. But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like tragedy. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had lived fast and dangerously, thrust into a life they could neither escape nor control. And now, in the light of a Louisiana morning, their story had ended in a hail of bullets. The news of their deaths swept across the nation like wildfire. Crowds mobbed funeral parlors and lined streets, desperate for a glimpse of the outlaws even in death. Photographs of their shattered car, riddled with more than 100 bullet holes, blanketed the front pages. Opinion on the couple was divided. To some, they were ruthless killers who got what they deserved. To others, they were tragic figures, a pair of star-crossed lovers who had lived outside the confines of societal rules, only to pay the ultimate price. What remained, however, was the undeniable weight of their love. Even in death, they were together. The final curtain had fallen on their storied lives, but the legend of Bonnie and Clyde, equal parts romance and rebellion, would live on. Their dreams, their flaws, their rebellion against a world that seemed determined to grind them down, they were all immortalized in that fateful moment on a quiet Louisiana road. And so, with the end of their lives came the birth of their myth, destined to capture imaginations and inspire stories for generations to come. The news of Bonnie and Clyde's bloody demise reverberated across the nation, sparking reactions as polarized as the couple themselves. For law enforcement, it was a triumphant moment. Headlines lauded Frank Hamer and his posse for their unflinching resolve in bringing down two of America's most wanted criminals. Their precision and the dramatic nature of the ambush marked a major victory in the ongoing battle against the lawlessness that had gripped the nation during the Great Depression. Celebrations erupted within police ranks, with the infamous duo laid to rest as a warning to other criminals on the run. Yet among the public, the reaction was far more complex. Thousands flocked to view Bonnie and Clyde's bullet-ridden car, its gruesome contents a morbid testament to their violent lives. Crowds lined up for hours outside funeral homes, desperate for just a glimpse of the couple. To the disenchanted masses of the Depression era, Bonnie and Clyde had represented something far more nuanced than mere criminals. They were symbols of defiance, young lovers from humble beginnings who had taken on a system that many felt had betrayed them. Their deaths struck a chord of sorrow even among those who condemned their actions, for they embodied a romantic tragedy that transcended judgment. It wasn't long before their story began its transformation into legend. Films, songs, and books emerged, glorifying their escapades and framing them as outlaws driven by love rather than greed or malice. Bonnie's wistful poetry, uncovered amid the blood-stained chaos of their deaths, painted her as a dreamer, yearning for a life she could never have. Clyde, depicted as a loyal protector, became a figure of undying devotion in an unforgiving world. Together they were cast as modern-day Robin Hoods, flawed perhaps, but relatable in their humanity. But beneath the romanticized veneer lay a far grittier reality. Were they villains to be condemned for their violence, or victims of a society that left them with few alternatives? Their upbringing in poverty, marked by a desperation that bred crime, begged the question of whether their downfall was inevitable. Could a different system, a kinder, more forgiving one, have saved them? Ultimately, their story is a testament to how love can be both a sanctuary and a dangerous force, binding two people together even as it drives them towards ruin. It's a story of hardship and rebellion, of choices born of desperation, and of the haunting consequences of those choices. The lives of Bonnie and Clyde are woven with themes that continue to echo profoundly through history, each thread offering insight into the human condition. Foremost among these is the theme of love amid hardship. Their unwavering devotion to one another was both their greatest source of strength and their undoing. Together they found solace in a world that often sought to crush them. Yet that same deep bond forged in shared adversity pushed them further down a path of destruction. Their partnership was both an anchor and a weight, tethering them to choices that sealed their fate. Equally important is the theme of poverty and desperation. Bonnie and Clyde were born into hardscrabble lives during one of the most challenging periods in American history. Their early years, shaped by scarcity and struggle, carved out a worldview where survival often meant breaking the law. Their crimes were less about malice and more about their fight against a system that seemed indifferent to their suffering. They became the faces of a broader societal tension, individuals caught between the crushing weight of poverty and a yearning for something better. Yet perhaps the most enduring theme is the battle of fiction versus reality. The mythologized version of their story, a couple of dashing outlaws in love, challenging authority with flair and romance, often overshadows the truth. Bonnie and Clyde's crimes were undeniably ruthless at times, and the suffering they inflicted on others cannot be ignored. However, the world prefers to remember them as rebels, elevated by the romance of their tale. This dichotomy between who they were and how they're remembered speaks to humanity's deep need for heroes, even flawed ones, in the face of systemic injustice and societal hardship. Through these themes, their story asks timeless questions about the intersection of love, adversity, and morality. It challenges us to consider the ways in which systems of power shape individual lives and actions. And it reminds us how easily history's harsh edges are softened by the allure of a good story. And so we're left with the enduring enigma of Bonnie and Clyde. Were they ruthless criminals who cared little for the lives they disrupted? Or were they desperate souls shaped by a world that left them with few options? Were they villains or tragic figures playing out the inevitable script of their time? Perhaps, as is so often the case with great tales, the truth lies somewhere in the gray space between absolutes. It's a tale that forces us to reckon with themes of love both fiery and fragile, with hardship that breeds defiance, and with the romantic lens through which we choose to view the past. Even now, their story continues to fascinate, a reminder of the enduring appeal of outlaws in the American imagination. They invite us to reflect on the systems that create such figures and the choices, both their own and society's, that lead to such tragic ends. Ultimately, their story is a mirror, reflecting the complexities of human nature and the enduring hunger for stories of rebellion and romance. Bonnie and Clyde lived fast and died young, but their lives linger in the collective memory, asking us, even now, to consider the weight of love, the cost of defiance, and the fragile line between villain and victim. Thank you for listening to today's True Crime Sleep story. Be sure to check the show notes for links to the YouTube and Instagram. If you're interested in going to CrimeCon 2025 in Denver, Colorado, please use my discount code, BRINK. It helps us so much if you use that code, and everybody who uses the code can DM me or stop by my table at CrimeCon for your free copy of True Crime Sleep Stories Volume 1, 2, or 3. Until next time, stay safe, sleep tight, and be sure to lock your doors at night. Bye-bye.